and gentlemen, distinguished guests and authorities, it's really a great pleasure and honor to be back in Delhi. I used to come regularly to India before COVID, and then during COVID everything was remote. I think we're all a little bit zoomed out, and now it's a great pleasure to see people in person rather than virtually. It's always great to come back to India because this is a strong democracy and a strong economy. And actually, I do believe that India could become the most important country in the world over the medium term. I think there are three factors that are going to lead it. One, you have a population is now the largest in the world and is young and growing, and that's a source of high potential growth. Secondly, your per capita income is still much lower than the one of China, about a quarter, but that implies that with the right policy, potential growth can be 7% or even higher. During the last few decades, China was growing faster than India. In the next few decades, India is going to grow much faster than China. So it's going to become a strong economic power. And three, India is going to also become a major geo-economic and geopolitical power, first in Asia and globally. And as we know, there are geopolitical tensions, and one of the rising powers in the world, even from a security point of view, is going to be India. I'm here to talk about what's the global economic outlook. And realistically, if we look around the world, we live in a period of unprecedented, unusual, unexpected uncertainty. So 4 U's. I recently published a new book titled Mega Threats, 10 Dangerous Trends that Imperil Our Future and How to Survive Them. And here I address in this book a number of, on one side, economic, monetary and financial threats that imperil our economic and monetary and financial future, but also non-economic threats that are correlated and connected with the economic ones. Even if you think about the economic threats, they are very different in many ways from those that we're facing even a few years ago. For example, until 2 years ago, in most advanced economies, there was worry about lowflation, if not deflation. Central banks had a hard time to achieve an inflation of 2%. Inflation was persistently below. Today, instead, in advanced economies in the emerging markets, we have to worry about inflation to be too high rather than too low. And inflation has been significantly above the 2% targets in advanced economies. A couple of years ago, we were worrying about what people refer to as secular stagnation, a situation where there were excess savings, low aggregate demand that led to weak economic growth, but also to lowflation, if not deflation. Today, we have to worry about the opposite phenomenon, the risk of stagflation, a situation where you have inflation and potentially recession at the same time in advanced economies because there are a number of aggregate negative supply shocks that are eating economic growth while raising the cost of productions. A couple of years ago, people in the advanced economies were worried about interest rates being too low. About $18 trillion equivalent of public debt in Europe and Japan had negative nominal interest rates up to maturities of 10 years. Today, the opposite problem. Because of rising inflation, central banks are increasing policy rates, long-term interest rates are going higher. But these high interest rates in a world where there is too much debt, private debt and public debt that has gone from 100% of GDP in the 70s to 350% of GDP last year globally, those rising interest rates create the risk of debt crisis in the private sector and the public sector, in the country, in the sectors where those debt ratios are high. In the public sector, in addition to explicit debt, there is even implicit debt coming from unfunded liabilities, coming from aging of populations and unfunded pension and aging as expenses for healthcare. A few years ago, we were worried about the excesses of hyper-globalization, but now we have to worry about the opposite. We have to worry about deglobalization, about protectionism, about restriction to trade in goods, in services, in the movement of capital, labor, technology, data, information. We're going in a world that is becoming fragmented, if not balkanized. A couple of years ago, we were worried about the everything bubble. There was an asset bubble in most risky and other assets. There was a boom and a bubble. Today, we're worried about asset deflation. The bubble has gone bust, Last year there was a massive correction of US global equity and other risky assets, and now we're going from a boom and a bubble to a bust and a crash in financial markets. So the nature of the economic, monetary, and financial risk is very different today than the one it was even a couple of years ago. But in addition to these economic, monetary, and financial threats, we're also facing a number of them that are non-economic ones, that are important, and they interact with the economic ones. For example, we live in a world that is characterized by a geopolitical depression, where a number of revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan, are challenging the economic, monetary, financial, trading, political, and geopolitical order that the US, Europe, the West, and their allies around the world, including Asia, created after World War II. We already have a hot war between Russia and Ukraine. It could become unconventional and involve NATO. I was recently in Israel, where in Israel there is a recognition that Iran is becoming effectively a threshold nuclear state, and Israel will have to decide whether to attack Iran or use deterrence. And of course, the Cold War between US and China is becoming colder by the day, with the risk eventually even on a military conflict on the issue of Taiwan. So this geopolitical depression is leading to a decoupling, the fragmentation of the global economy, balkanization of global supply chains. We've gone from free trade to secure trade, from offshoring to reshoring and friendshoring, from just-in-time global supply chains to just-in-case that are redundant. And going from efficiency to security, of course, has economic cost. Secondly, in terms of non-economic threats, we have global climate change that is becoming a disaster. Last year, in India and Pakistan, this region of the world, you had massive droughts followed by massive floods. The damage coming from climate change is severe. Of course, the third threat is the one of global pandemics. COVID-19, unfortunately, is not going to be the last and most severe pandemic. There will be other ones. And either we address them and prevent them, or the economic and fiscal costs are going to be huge. We live also in a world in which now there is massive technological innovation, AI, machine learning, robotic, automation, and quantum computing. The economic pie may increase, and there will maybe eventually increase in productivity growth, but there is a dark side to this technological innovation. There could be eventually permanent, massive technological unemployment among low and medium value-added blue collars and white collars. And these types of innovation unfortunately increase income and wealth inequality because they are capital-intensive, skill bias, and labor savings. So AI is an opportunity, but if not managed right, is a threat. And finally, on the political side, because of economic malaise, because of rise in income and wealth inequality, because many young generations feel that their own economic opportunities are not going to be as good as their own parents, there is now a backlash against liberal democracy. And unfortunately, in many parts of the world, both advanced economy and emerging markets, some extremist, radical, populist regimes of the extreme right or the extreme left are becoming to power. So liberal democracy is being challenged as well. Now, I talk about this phenomenon and the interaction between economic and non-economic threats as mega threats, but there are other similar terms. This past year, the Financial Times talked about the concept of poly-crisis and made it one of the buzzwords of the year. It's the same idea, that economic and non-economic threats are feeding on each other. I was just in December presenting my book in a debate with the head of the IMF, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, and she has spoken about a confluence of calamities like we have never seen since World War II. And last month I was in Davos for the World Economic Forum, and the global risk report of the WEF was exactly about poly-crisis, mega threats, and interaction between these economic and non-economic threats. So whether you call them mega threats, or whether you call them poly-crisis, or whether you call it a confluence of calamities, or whether, as the WEF says, we'll have the most turbulent and stable decade in decades coming, we're facing a series of interconnected threats that are impairing our economic, financial future, but also the future of humanity and the future of the planet because of climate change, because of global pandemics. Now, of course, in the short run, The kind of risks that we have to face are those of the risk of inflation, of potential recession and stagflation, and mounting debt ratios that are becoming unsustainable if interest rates are going to go higher in nominal and real terms. I think that the great moderation, unfortunately, is over, the period of low inflation and relatively stable economic growth, and we might be going to a period that is more unstable, what I call great stagflationary and debt instability. Of course, the causes of the rise in inflation in advanced economies and some emerging markets after COVID were several. On one side, bad policy, loose monetary, fiscal, and credit easing, too much and for too long. But there was also bad luck, a series of negative aggregate supply shocks that hit the global economy. First of all, the negative impact of COVID on supply of goods, services, shutting down economic activity, impairing global supply chains, and reducing the labor supply. Secondly, the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine led to a spike in commodity prices, oil, natural gas, industrial metals, green metals, food and fertilizers. And finally, until recently, the zero COVID policy of China was also hampering production in China and creating further bottlenecks in global supply chains. However, even if, as hopefully, some of these negative supply shocks are going to phase out, maybe COVID is over, maybe eventually the Russian invasion of Ukraine will stop. Now that China has eliminated the zero COVID policy, those bottlenecks should go away. There are some more medium to long-term negative aggregate supply shocks that can reduce potential growth, can increase the cost of production, and with loose monetary fiscal policy can lead to inflation and to recession and stagflation. And we're facing a number of more medium-term negative aggregate supply shocks. I don't have time to go over all of them, but think of it this way. 1, deglobalization and protectionism. 2, reshoring or friendshoring and producing not where it's low cost, but where it's higher cost. Aging of population in advanced economies, but also in major emerging markets like China, like Russia, like Taiwan, like Korea, and so on. Restriction to migration in Europe and US. In the past, migration reduced wage growth. A geopolitical depression and decoupling is leading to a fragmentation of the global economy. Global climate change that increases the cost of food because of desertification, lack of water, and to other channels increases energy costs. Pandemics that, of course, are stagflationary shocks. The existence of cyber warfare that either cuts down production or if you want to protect yourself, it's very costly. There's now finally also a backlash against rising income inequality, leading into fiscal policies that are pro-labor, pro-union, pro-workers. Might be the right thing to do to avoid social strife, but increases wage inflation. And finally, the US and Europe are weaponizing the dollar and the euro for national security and foreign policy purposes. That might be the right thing to do to deter your rivals, but it creates frictions in the international payment system. Sands in the wheel that is also stagflationary. So these are on the supply side. On the demand side, we're facing a situation where, as I pointed out, debt ratio, private and public, as a share of GDP, have gone from 100% in the 70s to 350 last year globally, 420 in advanced economies, 330 in China. Central banks are in a trap, in a debt trap, because if they were to increase interest rates enough to fight inflation, not only that would cause a hard landing of the economy, but it would also cause a financial crash. And a financial crash and a debt crisis is going to lead to a worse recession, and a worse recession, of course, is going to make debt ratio even more severe. So the combination of those supply factors and the demand side, debt trap implies that inflation is going to be higher over the medium long term. This is a structural factor. Now, in the short term, the global economic outlook is slightly better compared to 6 months ago, when the IMF had a very dark view of the world. The US data and the European data have been better than expected. China is reopening. And of course, India has been doing well from a point of economic growth in the last few months. However, I think there are still downside risks that may imply we may end up with a hard landing of the global economy, especially advanced economies, rather than a softer or softish landing, for a number of reasons. First of all, the war between Russia and Ukraine is going to get worse this year. Unfortunately, That's going to further spike commodity prices. Israel might strike Iran because of the nuclear capability of Iran. That could lead to a spike in energy prices. And in China, the COVID now is spreading like wildfire, reducing the supply of labor, or if China were to grow faster, the demand for commodities is going to rise, pushing higher commodity prices. And for commodities, there is massive today underinvestment into new capacity, not only in energy, but also in green metals, where there is green inflation, and industrial metals. And therefore, firms like Goldman Sachs expect that this year commodity prices may go up globally more than 40%. That's implying higher inflation, not lower inflation. Secondly, labor markets in advanced economies are tight. Low unemployment rates, aging of population, restriction of migration, skills mismatches, great resignation, fall in labor force participation rate. Wage growth is 5-6% in the US. It's not consistent with inflation going to 2%. And finally, inflation in the service sector depends on labor costs, because in the service sector is mostly labor costs. And therefore, if wage inflation is going to remain high, core inflation is not going to fall toward 2%. That is to risk that inflation is going to surprise on the upside in advanced economies, but also in emerging markets, that central banks will have to raise the interest rates even more so, and then raising interest rates more than they expect, and more than the market expect, eventually is going to lead to a hard landing of the real economy and to financial distress because of rising debt servicing ratios. So while most people hope in a soft landing of the economy, I worry about the hard landing. I want to make a final point about India. India is a country that's done a lot in terms of economic policies. It created an infrastructure boom and internal market. It has developed industrial policies that are leading to growth of manufacturing sector. It has a comparative advantage in IT, technology, and technological services, including fintech. And it's created welfare system that is based on a tech stack that allows micro-targeting. All of this is positive. I would have only one particular specific concern. The biggest problem that India is going to face in the next few years are more micro and structural rather than macro and cyclical. Of course, on the macro side, inflation is still too high. Deficits and debt in the public sector are high. But I would say that the micro concerns are more important. Why do I say so? The growth of India is becoming increasingly driven by national champions that are large, private, oligopolistic conglomerates. On one side, that might be seen as positive because they are productive, efficient, and competitive. And they've been actually creating a lot of economic growth. India's been growing fast, even with much lower investment ratios than China, because of the better efficiency of the investment and allocation of savings to investment. On the other side, however, this oligopoly eventually will hamper competition, domestic and internationally, risk killing new entrants and startups, and they may lead eventually to lower total factor productivity growth. In fact, if you look at the data, potential growth in India today is not going higher. It's either stagnant at around 6-7% or falling. And I think that degree of oligopoly in parts of the corporate sector is part of the reason why that's happening. Finally, I would argue that there is risk of developing an economic model based on chronic capitalism. It's going to lead to reduced economic growth, reduced institutional robustness, and a negative perception of the country by global investors. You want to avoid that. You want to go to a growth model that is dynamic, is productive, is globally competitive, that is sustainable, that is fair. I think that India can do it, but you need to have also the right economic policies. Thank you very much.